Hi there, and welcome to Google Cloud's digital conference. Better code?
Faster. Today, we're going to talk about adopting continuous delivery. And good news, we have some Googlers standing by to answer your questions live. So please, click the icon on the left and ask away.
But what is continuous delivery?
Yeah, let's start with the definition.
It's the ability to get changes of all types, features, config changes, bug fixes, and experiments into prod or into the hands of users safely, quickly, and in a sustainable way. So another way to say this, we should be able to push to prod, and it should be boring.
Yes. So CD, or continuous delivery, is probably a term that you've heard. Over the past decade, there's another term that you may have come across. That term is called DevOps. And DevOps, just like continuous delivery, has so many different definitions. So what I'd like to do as we frame up this talk is give you a definition of DevOps. So for me, DevOps is a cultural and professional movement focused on how we build and operate high-velocity organizations born from the experiences of its practitioners. Let's just break that down really quickly. First, it's a cultural and professional movement. It's not a tool. It is about the people. Next, it's about building and operating, dev and ops, a high-velocity organization. But actually, when we think about a high-velocity organization, that goes beyond just dev and ops. We have to think about the entire organization. And then finally, it's born from the experience of its practitioners. The way that you will come to understand DevOps is by doing DevOps. And that also really leads to this industry or this community where we have multiple different definitions for that word DevOps. Again, because it's born out of the experiences of those practitioners.
Absolutely, and I love that point, right? So let's notice that CD and DevOps are different, and it's also about delivering value for organizations, right? It's about how we operate these organizations and deliver value. So we'll come to that in a minute. Oops. I think we forgot to mention who we are.
Oh, right.
My bad.
We should do that.
By the way, I'm Nicole Forsgren.
And I'm Nathan Harvey. I'm a developer advocate here at Google. Nicole, what is it that you do here?
I do research and strategy in Google Cloud.
Right.
Which, by the way, let's talk about some of this research that I've been doing over the last several years. So when we're talking about delivering value for organizations, when we talk about it in the context of DevOps, it's about delivering software to our users. And it's about dev and ops working together, like you mentioned. So what that means is throughput for developers, right? We want to create code, and stability for ops. We want to make sure our systems stay up. So how do we measure that? It's about outcomes, not just output. So throughput is things like delivery lead time, code commit to code deploy. How long does that take? Deployment frequency. How often are we pushing code? Time to restore service. When things do go down or when we have any type of incident, how long does it take to come up? And change fail rate. What does it look like? How often do we have incidents when we do push code?
And so, Nicole, you do a lot of research. You've got these great metrics. What does the research tell us?
The research shows us that the high performers are able to achieve both throughput and stability together in tandem. There aren't really trade-offs. And what we see is that when we compare the high performers and the low performers, we see great performance. So when we look at high performers and their code deployments, we see 46 times more frequent code deployments. When we take a look at time for lead time from commit to deploy, we see that they're over 2,500 times faster. Now, their stability metrics are also fantastic. We see that they have 7 times lower change fail rate. And then we take a look at their time to recover from incidents. It's over 2,600 times faster. Now, when we think about what that means in terms of delivering value to their organizations, sometimes people say, but wait, Nicole, this is just software. They're just going faster. They're just more stable. This means they're able to deliver value because they can pivot when they need to pivot. They can keep up with compliance and regulatory changes. This really does so much for their business and for their customers.
Really creating that high velocity organization.
Exactly.
Now, listen, if this is what the research bears out, what's stopping you? Why isn't every organization adopting continuous delivery? Well, it turns out there's been a lot of research done on exactly that. And that research tells us that there were a myriad of reasons why you're not doing continuous delivery. A lot of things that are getting in your way. Things like work blockage, broken builds, merge conflicts, architectures that don't make sense, that allow you to do things very fast and very efficiently. So we have to figure out how do we get away from this? How do we remove some of these blockers so that we can actually start adopting these processes?
Right. The work is hard, right?
Absolutely.
But it's also worth it.
Yeah. So does your research tell us anything about that?
Absolutely. The thing that's important is making sure that we focus on the capabilities that really drive improvement in our ability to develop and deliver software with both speed and stability. So a bunch of the research that I've done with my team, Jez Humble, Gene Kim, focuses on a handful of core capabilities that fall into a handful of categories. Things like continuous delivery, some core technical practices, architecture, architecting our systems in ways that allow us to do things more nimbly, product and process, as well as things like lean management and monitoring, as well as cultural practices. Like you said, it's also a cultural movement. So what if we dig into a handful of examples that we've seen?
Yeah, let's talk about some of those capabilities. Now, of course, we don't have time to dig into all of the capabilities.
I wish we could next time.
Maybe next time. Maybe next time, for sure.
Okay.
For sure. But what we can do today is we can give a high-level survey of a good handful of them. Yeah. These are ones that you should definitely consider. The first and most important, actually, maybe we shouldn't call it the first. Maybe it's the 0th capability that you should focus on.
It's pretty foundational.
It is absolutely foundational, and that is version control. Every piece of code that you write, every configuration that you have for your software, for your systems, for your applications, all of that must be stored in version control. When we think about the idea of throughput and stability, think about how version control's role in both of those capabilities. How do we move faster with version control? Well, we all can see the changes that are being made. That's a shared version control system that everyone on your team has access to. And how does it help us with stability? Well, of course, we understand all of the changes that are made. We can easily rewind some of those changes, go back to the configurations or the code that we had before. We can move forward in time, backward in time, and really get a better understanding of how the system works, how it's changed over time.
So this brings us to code review. So often when we talk about DevOps in circles, we talk about things like building quality in. And it's so important because it just doesn't do us very much good when we find errors right as we're about to go into production, or worse yet, in production, because it's so expensive and so costly and it takes so much time to fix things. So what we want to do is we want to find errors early, build quality in up front. Code review is one of my favorite opportunities to do that. So for those of you who don't know, code review is sitting down and having a peer review your code, oftentimes a peer. Another reason I love code review is it's a fantastic alternative to change advisory boards, or CABs. Fun fact here, CABs are negatively correlated with software delivery performance.
Ooh, they make it worse?
I mean, in many ways, yes. And here's why. Change advisory boards are even negatively correlated with stability. People often know that it'll be negatively correlated with speed. Obviously, it slows it down, but it's also negatively correlated with stability. Here's a reason that that's probably true. As you slow things down, it means that that code that you're finally pushing into production will be very large. It'll have a large blast radius. It's really hard to do. So what we should be doing instead is having a lightweight change approval process, and one of the best ways to do that is with code review. What do you think about code review?
I mean, I love code review because when we sit down with another engineer, there's a couple of things that happen. One of which is that new engineer or that other engineer or my peer brings a fresh perspective to that code, and they oftentimes make sure I haven't done something that's too clever with the code. So clever that I won't understand what it did when I get woken up at 2 a.m. to fix it.
Exactly. And oftentimes they know the code base better than someone like a cab would know anyway. Okay, next up on our pipeline is continuous integration. Now, continuous integration, or CI, is another one of these interesting things because so often when I go to work with and talk with customers, they have their very own definition. So it's important to touch on a few key things when we're talking about CI. One is that when you check in code, you should have an automated trigger of a build of software. Another is that when you check in code, it should automatically trigger tests and automated tests of software. Another is that if anything breaks the build or breaks the tests, they should be fixed right away. They shouldn't just sit broken as you continue work. The whole team should swarm together and they should fix things. Now, we could talk about this forever, but really those are the most important pieces, and here's why.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit more about automated testing. And testing is a broad topic, whether we're talking about unit tests, integration tests, functional testing, performance tests. The important thing here is that as you're building out your pipeline, you automate those tests. Those automated tests can be as simple as enforcing or checking your style guidelines. Do we use tabs or spaces? Spaces or tabs? Which should we use, Nicole?
Well, let's not get into that fight.
Yeah, we don't have to because we have automated tests that can check for that and help enforce that. It also means that our code reviews can actually focus on the functionality of the code. And through this automated testing, we can start to build more confidence that the changes we're introducing are going to do exactly what we expect them to do. And as you start thinking about introducing tests, remember that that's what you're trying to prove out. We want to get faster feedback. And in fact, as you mentioned, when the build breaks, when your tests fail, you should stop working on new things and fix that build.
Exactly. Now, the other thing that's important about automated testing is that when we do these things in automated ways, it lets us be more consistent, more repeatable, and more reliable. Something that's important in testing and something that's also super important in our next step.
Yes, automated deployment.
Yes. And you know what? The thing that's really important here is, again, the same thing you just mentioned. We want it to be consistent. We want it to be repeatable. We want it to be reliable, because this is the most important place for that to happen, because it's right when we're going into prod. And why is this so important? Because it's also auditable.
Yes, yes. And now that we've moved this change into production, we have some other considerations. Yeah. So in production, we have things like data. And we have to start thinking about good data management practices and good data management hygiene. So as one example, your developers, as they're building out new features, are going to want to work with a data set that resembles your production data. But stop for a minute and think about that. You can't simply copy all of your production data and give it to all of your developers unchanged. It's not that we don't trust them, but that's not a safe way to handle that data. There may be really sensitive data that's stored in that data. We need to anonymize that data and do that in a way that is sound, so that our developers have good data that they can write their tests against, that they can see how the application works locally, but is also treating that user data with the utmost respect and privacy that it actually deserves. Now, we also, when we're thinking about introducing change, not only do we have to think about how do we manage that data, but that data is eventually going to be stored in some sort of persistent store, like a database. And a database typically has a schema associated with it.
Exactly.
So how do we test those schema changes, and how do we roll those changes out as well? These are all things that you have to consider.
And how do we make it visible to everyone throughout the chain?
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
So we can think about these things and making them visible and shifting left throughout the process, just like we have through so many other things. Speaking of shifting left,
yes.
Right? Security.
No, left.
Yeah, shifting left. Thanks. It's so important to do in security as well, right? So DevOps is about taking operations and shifting so many of those practices and processes and disciplines left into dev.
Right.
So that they're aware of things like scalability and reliability. Database often is about taking things like database schema changes and shifting them left. Security is very much the same way. Instead of doing something like a pen test right before we release to prod,
right,
finding 27 errors and only having time to fix 3, which is a bad, risky security posture, what we can do instead is shift left on security. Integrate and include the security team very early in things like design, demos, security reviews, include them in the design of our automated tests like we talked about.
Right.
We can understand and find and fix our security errors. We can remediate, we can build quality and security quality in early, right, and put ourselves in a much better place.
Yeah, and when we shift things like security to the left, we move them earlier in the development process, not only does that help us build safer applications, but it also gives the developers feedback sooner. So you can catch the things that need to be changed before they make it out of your hands. Exactly. And then through these practices, we can now actually start to talk about implementing continuous delivery. Continuous delivery where we can take small changes and we can push those changes all the way through our pipeline from the developer's workstation all the way out to the production environment. And when we start implementing this continuous delivery ideas, we also have to start thinking about what does it mean to actually deliver? What does it mean to actually deploy code? because maybe there's a very risky change that your testing can only uncover so much. Maybe you have to think about different ways of delivering that code to your users. Maybe there's a slow rollout where you have some canary testing where that change goes out to a small set of your features. You watch how that change works, how your users interact with that new feature before making a decision about whether or not to roll out that change more broadly. But as you start thinking about this, you'll start thinking about feature flags. How do I do smaller things? How do I continuously deliver value to my business and to my customers?
Now is when we can start talking about things like trunk-based development. This is another thing that's important when we talk about continuous delivery. Now, so often people want to develop on branches, right? Because it feels safer, because it's an isolated environment. Now, the challenge here, though, is that when we develop on branches and not on mainline or trunk, what happens is I have a branch, you have a branch.
My branch is great.
My branch is great. Someone else has a branch. The challenge comes when we have to integrate these branches back into mainline, back into trunk. And then I have to find a way to integrate my changes and your changes and everyone else's changes, and we end up overwriting or losing code.
Right.
Now, if we've been checking in every day, and if we have, let's say, less than 3 branches at a time, we don't have these challenges of losing code. We don't have code lock or code freeze periods. So we don't lose productivity.
Right.
Now, there's some strategies that we can use, because when I first talk about this many times, people say, does this mean that I have to completely finish a feature, an entire feature or an entire product in a day? No, that doesn't mean that. But what we can do instead is we can adopt good hygiene and good habits and use things like feature flags.
Right.
And we can learn to decompose our work into much, much smaller pieces. What that also means is as we start pushing code, we're pushing in much, much smaller pieces so that then when it hits prod, it's smaller. It has a smaller blast radius.
That's right. And just like I talked about before, it's also about improving that feedback or shortening that feedback cycle. If I have visibility into the changes that you've made, not only can we move faster, but I also can understand how your changes might impact the changes that I'm working on. And that is super important. And at the end of the day, as we're thinking about DevOps and continuous delivery, we always come back to this idea of we're here to build a high-velocity organization. It's about delivering business value. And that means that we need to make sure our incentives are aligned. And in a traditional environment, the incentives between developers and operators simply aren't aligned. Developers are incentivized to build features, build them fast, and have a lot of agility. Where we then turn to our operators and say, your job is stability. Keep the systems up and running. And one easy way to keep systems stable is to accept no change. And that doesn't do anyone any good. If we align our objectives and align our incentives so that we actually understand we are working together in concert to serve the users, to serve our business, to help our customers. That's the thing that's important.
Absolutely. Now, how do we know how we're doing? As we start thinking about measuring our own progress and moving toward our own journey, what types of measures do we want to capture for ourselves? First, let's think about measuring our own progress and baselining, and then continuing on and measuring again into the future. Now, some people may say, but I'm not doing very well.
Right.
That's fine. Establish the baseline, even if it's bad, embrace the bad, and then move forward. Be honest. Now, let's measure our throughput and our stability metrics. These are good because they capture the work and the activity of the entire team, from dev all the way through to ops. So, what are these measures? The first is delivery lead time, code committed to code running in production. The next is deployment frequency. How often are we pushing code? Now, onto the stability metrics. First is time to restore service. How long does it take us to restore something? Anytime it goes down for any type of service incident. It doesn't have to go all the way down. Just how long does it take us when we need to give it attention? Finally, change fail rate. What percentage of changes require some type of attention when we push to production? Here's a summary of some of the work that we did in the 2018 Accelerate State of DevOps report. So here's how you read this chart. Anytime you see an arrow, you can read this as a predictive relationship. It's statistically predictive. You'll notice continuous delivery there in the middle. It drives software delivery performance. That's those throughput and stability metrics we've been talking about. Now you'll notice an extra little box there, availability. So that's particularly important for our customers that are in the cloud, because that's about making and keeping promises to our customers and that uptime. Now you'll notice that those are predictive of organizational performance. That's things like profitability, productivity, market share, effectiveness, efficiency, and customer satisfaction. It really does drive value. Now you'll notice the other things that drive SDO performance, that combination of throughput, stability, and availability, is organizational culture. Now, continuous delivery, how do we improve continuous delivery? You'll see things that we've talked about today, things like deployment automation, continuous integration, version control. You'll also notice a few more, and you can dig into the report. Things like monitoring and observability, continuous testing, having a loosely coupled architecture. So there is some additional readings out there.
Nicole, 1 minute before we move on from this. I see at the bottom of the slide it says deploy pain and burnout. So continuous delivery is going to lead to deploy pain and burnout?
I'm so glad you pointed that out. I love this part of the research, and I know you're making this face, but here's why I love it. Look at the arrow from continuous delivery to deploy pain and burnout, and notice there's a minus. Smart investments in technical practices that improve our continuous delivery lead to decreases in deploy pain. That's that anxiety that you feel when you push to prod because you're so afraid it's going to come down.
Yes.
And it might. Smart investments in continuous delivery also decrease burnout. This is worth it because it doesn't just lead to increased value for our organization. It makes our work better.
Absolutely.
I think it's so important.
So, continuous delivery. Take us out. Remind us, what is the definition for continuous delivery?
Honestly, I love the short version. Continuous delivery is the ability to push to prod and have it be boring. We can do this on a Tuesday afternoon.
That's amazing. I love Tuesday afternoons.
Right?
They're the best time to deploy
They're the
code.
best.
Yes. Now, remember though, this is a journey. Like I said, you're not going to wake up tomorrow and all of a sudden be doing continuous delivery. There's lots of hard work and change, and you and your teammates need to get dedicated to this change. And I want to leave you with a Japanese word that I think really embodies some of the journey that you're about to go on. And that word is this, it's shuhari. And shuhari actually can be broken down into 3 parts, shu, ha, and ri. And shu is this advice that what you should do is obey the traditional wisdom. We've introduced some technical practices. A great one that you talked about there, Nicole, was trunk-based development. And you probably heard those words come out of Nicole's mouth and thought to yourself, there's no way that will work here. And you know what? Maybe. But what you should do as you think about that practice is you should adopt it. You should work on it as a team, obey the wisdom of trunk-based development. Now, over time, it is true, you may find that there are slight tweaks to the ideas or the changes that you need to make for your organization. That's where you get into the ha. You break with tradition. That's the middle part of our word shuhari. We're breaking with tradition. We're starting to change it just a little bit, adapting it for our own personal needs. And then as you continue down this journey, you will transcend. You will reach the ri of shuhari. That is transcendence, where the techniques are not even things that you have to think about intentionally anymore. You've transcended the focus on those things. They've just become muscle memory. They're part of how you work. So look, the work that you're about to do is hard. You're not going to get there by talking about it, by reading about it, not even by coming to this conference. But you are going to get there because you're going to do the work, and you're going to go down this shuhari journey.
And I love that you pointed that out for shuhari, because so much of the research that we've done over the last 5 years, 30,000 data points around the world, industries of all kinds, including highly regulated, shows us that. It's all about execution. Now, I'm not saying that execution isn't difficult, but we do see in all of this data that if you execute, you can achieve high performance and you can see excellence.
You're not going to get there just by reading, but we do have some great reading suggestions for you.
So I'll start us off.
Great.
First, I would point anyone who's doing the work and really interested in technical details, take a look at Continuous Delivery. Go to the source. Written by Jez Humble, Dave Farley. This is going to be great for nuts and bolts. I almost treat it like a reference manual or a textbook. I keep it on my desk. Next up is Accelerate, written by myself, Nicole Forsgren, Jez Humble, Gene Kim. A great audience for this runs the gamut. Anyone from a CIO to a VP, all the way down to mid-level managers and ICs. This is going to be great because it helps explain why DevOps and technology transformations are important for businesses and business value. It also has a section on research methods and why you should trust the data. The thing I really love also is that part 3 includes a case study at ING written by Steve Bell and Karen Whitley Bell that walks you through what this feels like so you can really read it, see what this could be like at your own organization.
And so in addition to those 2 books, we also have some lighter weight reading for you. There's a publication called Information and Software Technology, and it included an article that talks about some of the roadblocks that get in your way when you want to do continuous delivery, but also talks about how do we remove some of those roadblocks. And by using the capabilities that we've covered here today, you're going to start to make real progress. And then the final one is the 2018 State of DevOps Report. Now, Nicole, you and your team built this report. And just remind me, did this report come before the book Accelerate or did it come out after the book Accelerate?
It's a great question. So it came right after. You could consider this almost like an appendix. So it includes additional capabilities like cloud, open source, outsourcing, infrastructure as code. We'll leave that as a teaser so you can check it out.
Absolutely. So take the capabilities that we've covered today, bring them back with your team and start putting that work to work. Take this reading list with you. And before we go, I'd just like to thank you for joining us today. Please remember that we have study jams online with the Kubernetes Quick Start starting right after this. Be sure to click the link in the blue bar below to get started. We hope you've enjoyed the conference.
Thanks for joining us.
Bye-bye.